This is the new TC Pride Podcast, Episode 30, Part 1 of 2016 Election Issues with Beth Zemsky. Hello and welcome to the Twin Cities Pride Podcast. I'm Ryan Garza. I'm here with our special guest, Beth Zemsky. Beth, thanks for being here.
Always glad to do it.
And so, Beth, you've been on the podcast before, but for people who aren't familiar with you or your work, can you please just talk a little bit about your background and maybe the organization that you're involved with currently?
Sure. So I was originally trained as a psychotherapist, but have been a community organizer in the LGBT community since the late 1980s. I was one of the first staff members at an organization now called Outfront Minnesota. I was the founding director of the LGBT program at the University of Minnesota, and chair of the board of an organization now called the National LGBTQ Task Force in the late 90s and early 2000. And I'm now currently on the National Action Council for the task force.
Awesome. So the reason that we're here today is that everybody knows we're about a week or so away from an election that really has a potential to affect the fight for LGBTQ rights, not just for the next 4 years, but potentially well into the future. The other reason is that, in talking to people all summer for the podcast, I kept hearing over and over again that our work isn't finished with gay marriage and that there's still a lot more work to do. And, not just here at home, but also in other parts of the world, which, you and I spoke about last time you were on the podcast. So what are some of these areas that you'd say where there is still work to be done? And then, how important is this election to not just gaining new ground, but in holding on to the ground that's recently been won?
Mm-hmm. So there's a number of issues that we're facing, and some of them are really state and local issues, and some of them are around the national election. So I want to start with some of the stuff that's showing up on state and local ballots, and that the biggest one we have to be concerned about is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was originally signed into law actually by Bill Clinton, but it was intended to allow people who had faith backgrounds that were not necessarily mainstream to practice their faith. It is now being used by the right to do things like, say, if you have a religious objection to serving LGBT people, that you don't have to. So can you imagine signs on bakeries saying no gays allowed? It's the kind of thing that was behind actually Mike Pence, who's now running with Donald Trump. It was what he tried to do in Indiana that led to a boycott of Indiana. So these laws are actually proliferating. They're not decreasing around the country. And that has, and the local elections, state and local elections really matter, what we call the down ballot elections. Everybody's very focused on the presidency, but a lot of what impacts our lives as LGBT people in Minnesota and around the country actually happens at the state of local level. And the Republicans control most of the state houses and the governorships. And so we're not just talking about trans bills in North Carolina or elsewhere. I want to get back to North Carolina. But we're really talking about sort of what does it mean to even be able to get equal service. And so if Religious Freedom Restorations Acts pass, all of the non-discrimination acts that we've passed around the country are going to be gutted. They're going to be much less meaningful and impactful because there'll be these loopholes in them where we can continue to be discriminated against.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that because probably, a lot of people aren't aware that these kind of down ballot elections matter.
Well, and in fact, those are the kinds of things that on a day-to-day basis impact more the quality of our life. The big issues like marriage, now that we have marriage, the Supreme Court is clearly important. And the next president is going to be able to appoint a number of justices. And that will make some really big differences in how the laws get interpreted, particularly if some of these bad laws pass, like the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and they wind up in the Supreme Court. If we have a Supreme Court that is appointed potentially by a President Clinton, they're more likely to find those laws unconstitutional, which they are, rather than a Supreme Court appointed by somebody else. So some of the other issues around transgender inclusion, transgender rights, and what is the so-called bathroom bill. One of the things that I think happens also that we have to be really aware of is that on an ongoing basis, both at the state and local level and the national level, our community is being used as fodder to cover other issues. So, for example, that bill, we call it the bathroom bill, and clearly that's what gets people upset. on both the LGBT community as well as other folks. But I want to say two things about that bill. One is there's a lot of other stuff in that bill that potentially impacts additional people in addition to the trans community. For example, that bill also takes away the right of local municipalities to have LGBT inclusive civil rights laws. And it also takes away the right for anybody who perceives a civil rights violation in that state to be able to use the state systems to file a civil rights grievance. They have to go to the federal courts for civil rights grievance. So it's essentially gutted some of our basic tenets of civil rights protection, not just for LGBT people, but for a lot of people. And so one of the things that's really interesting is that that's not something that's getting talked about. And it's partly because a lot of what happens is the right has framed it around transgender people as the most potentially marginalized and most potentially folks with the most disparity in our community, and has really scapegoated them by calling it the bathroom bill. When if we really were able not to fall into their framing about it and really be able to say, yeah, this is about, we want transgender folks to be able to use the bathroom that matches their identity. And we also want local civil rights laws. And we also want African Americans who perceive that they've been discriminated against to have redress in the state. But the right has been very clever about the way they have used the discrimination against transgender people as the most marginalized and least well understood in order to cover a lot of other issues that are going on. So we really have to pay attention to the way we're being used.
The other thing, too, I guess part of the discussion that I wanted to have with you was about how what happens here politically at home in America affects the LGBTQ community or LGBTQ individuals in other parts of the world. But I guess if we kind of look at just our political landscape here, we're in Minnesota, right, which is a fairly progressive part of the country. How would you say what happens here affects other parts of the country where maybe, they aren't as progressive as we are?
Well, you had said something before about Keith Ellison saying not voting is not protest, it's surrender. And I really agree with that because historically, Minnesota's had one of the strongest voter turnouts in the country. And I think particularly in this election, I think we really need to pay attention to voter turnout and paying attention to these down ballot races. Because if we can, in Minnesota, have a progressive legislature, it's going to be who really pass good laws for LGBT people, for working people, partner with Black Lives Matter around police. They're not going to be able to do it in other parts of the country. Right, so I think that we really have to make a statement this year and make that statement really loudly around the kinds of issues that we care about.
And then what are some other issues that maybe people aren't as aware of, being so heavily involved on a day-to-day basis as you are? Like, what are some other issues that people might not be as aware of?
Yeah, so I think some of the things that we don't always think of as quote-unquote gay issues are really, really significant. And I want to talk about a couple of those. One specifically is voting rights. So we can elect anybody, hopefully we'll elect good candidates this year. But if the trend continues and state legislatures and the National Republican Party continues to pass voter restriction laws, what it'll mean is we win this year, they pass voter restriction laws, and it fundamentally undermines our democracy. And so we might pass whatever, but the possibility of sustaining any effort continues to decrease as more and more people are disenfranchised by voter restriction laws. I think it's really important that when we turn back the anti-marriage amendment, we also turn back a voter ID amendment. And that was the first time in the country a voter ID amendment had lost. And it was the first time a same-sex marriage amendment, anti-same-sex marriage amendment, had lost. And I think that the fact that, we did some co-organizing in that campaign with Take Action Minnesota around those two issues, because I think they're connected. So I think as LGBT people, we really have to think about the health of our democracy that voter ID laws get impacted by. The other things I think we really need to watch out for that we don't always think of as quote-unquote gay issues is all the anti-immigration stuff. There's a higher percentage of immigrants and refugees that are LGBT identified, partly because they're fleeing persecution in other parts of the world and coming here. If we think about ISIS, and ISIS has a very draconian, homophobic, anti-gay agenda. So if anybody's even suspected of being gay, they're often murdered. I mean, there's videos of young gay men being thrown off buildings in ISIS controlled territory, and being tortured to turn over names of other gay people. So I think that when we only think of gay issues as this narrow range of things and don't understand how endemic homophobia is, and how diverse our own community is, I think we too narrowly define what is a gay issue.
So, I mean, what are some ways that the LGBTQ community in the States can affect change in those parts of the world for those individuals?
I think we need to get our own house in order. And part of what I mean about that, and now I want to talk specifically about the two candidates. Part of what Donald Trump is doing in his barrage of hate I'm getting messages from my friends around the world. It's like, what is going on there? You're supposed to be the bastion of democracy. You're supposed to be the people we look to counter the messages of hate. If he gets elected there, what hope is there for the folks in Europe who are trying to fight against the rising Islamophobia, the sort of anti-immigrant stuff, the kinds of stuff that's happening in France with right-wing backlash, the closing of the borders, the people in camps? Like, if you can't do this, who's going to do this? And so I want to say something about Donald Trump that I think is particularly a concern for us in the LGBT community, particularly in the last few weeks when the mask is sort of off in terms of his misogyny. Way back in the 70s, we started doing research on homophobia. There's a book by Suzanne Farr called Homophobia, a Weapon of Sexism. And there are other studies that have really said, look, what is underlying homophobia, a big chunk of homophobia, is about the protection of masculinity. And so the more we are in an environment of toxic masculinity, which is kind of what Donald Trump's doing, sort of revving folks up at the rallies and sort of, the way he's treating women, I think not only do lesbian and bi and trans women need to worry about that, but I think it really, if that rhetoric, if that point of view gets to be the dominant point of view, I think all of us need to be very concerned about the way toxic masculinity narrows the perception of gender, of permissible gender and permissible sex roles and gender roles. It's like, this is the way to be a man. This is just locker room talk. And men get to do these things. And and it's sort of like the definition of who controls whose body. I think all of that is an LGBTQ issue. And I think we need to be very concerned about that.
The TC Pride podcast has been a production of Podletter Media and Twin Cities Pride. Subscribe now on iTunes or Google Play and submit your first Pride story at myfirstpride.org.